I need to tell you something that took me way too long to figure out. For the first 24, 25 years of my life, every time I hit a wall, every time I failed, every time I looked at someone doing what I wanted to do and couldn't understand why I wasn't there yet, I had one answer. Work harder. Just work hard until you prove them wrong, put in more hours, be more disciplined, grind until it works, right? And of course, sometimes that works, right? But it's not the answer to everything. Sometimes it's more of a hiding place, a cover-up to reassure yourself that you're making progress, that you're doing something. But in reality, you're just spinning your wheels faster, putting more in to still get nothing out. And it took a fictional swordsman with a blade in his mouth for me to understand this. Because Roronoa Zoro never thought he could lose. The East Blue, which admittedly is the smallest, weakest sea in One Piece, but regardless, his name alone cleared rooms. Battalions of men just turned and ran, seeing him as something beyond human. He was a natural talent with an inhuman work ethic, and the combination never failed him. Not once. Every opponent fell, every challenge yielded. There was just one exception. As a child, Zoro fought a girl named Kuina 2,000 times and lost every single match. 2,000 attempts, 2,000 defeats, same opponent. And his response to each loss was exactly the same. And it's a pattern we see him carry on even into adulthood. Train harder, come back stronger, because that would work eventually, right? It had to. Surely. But one ordinary morning after his 2001st defeat, Kuina died. Not in battle, not because she was weak. It was just a fall down the stairs, the kind of accident that could happen to anyone. A car crash, a sudden illness, any number of things that remind you how fragile human beings actually are. She didn't die because she didn't train hard enough, right? Her death had nothing to do with effort or discipline or willpower. It was random, cruel, meaningless. And Zoro knew no other way to handle this but to work like a madman. He buried the grief under iron, distracted himself from that frustration by pushing himself harder and harder, quite literally clenching his teeth to carry her sword, her will on with him, until he became strong enough that the world couldn't take anything else away. And although maybe not in response to grief, I think this is something we've all done at some point. We lose or fail at something, and the only way we can think to handle that frustration, that anger, is to work harder and prove them wrong. And what makes Zoro so interesting is that for the next decade or so, this works, right? The world massively rewards him for it. He never has to ask anyone for anything. No one can take anything away from him. He's this invincible free man on his way to becoming the greatest swordsman and achieving everything he ever wanted. The world is showing him proof that he's doing everything correct until he finally discovers how big the world truly is at Barate. Zoro hears rumors of a man who can cut 50 ships by himself. And before he can even really process that, Don Creek's flagship, the strongest ship in the East Blue, is sliced clean in half in front of their eyes. Dracule Mihawk, the world's greatest swordsman, the title Zoro has trained his entire life for, is standing on the deck of a ruined ship, looking incredibly bored. And the first thing he says to Zoro, "Hear me, little frog in his well, it's time for you to realize that the world is bigger than what it seems from your well." Zoro attacks with everything, every ounce of skill and strength he's accumulated, and is all stopped by a knife. Zoro hasn't lost since he was a child, and now he's being treated like one again. Openly mocked and humiliated, and he doesn't understand it. It just genuinely baffles him that the world can't be this far away, right? Not with everything he's put in. It just doesn't make sense, right? Even if he can't beat him now, he's worked so hard, it shouldn't be this wide of a gap. It should be reachable. And this completely breaks his model of the world, because up until now, his thought process was, well, I'm talented, I work harder than everyone, I beat everyone I face, so I will eventually reach the top, right? But it wasn't enough. Mihawk buries a blade in Zoro's chest, and he doesn't move, doesn't flinch, doesn't step back. He instinctively knows that if he takes one step backwards, something important would have been irreversibly broken. He would have never become the greatest swordsman. And at the time, that seems like bravado, right? You know, the swordsman's code, cool anime moment from this very manly man, but it's deeper than that. Because think about how most people respond when they see clearly, undeniably, that they are nowhere near where they want to be. Think about the last time you saw someone succeeding at something you want, right? Whether that be a stranger posting something online or someone close to you. What was your gut reaction? Honestly, what was your initial reaction as soon as you saw that? What did most people in the comments say? How did they react? For most people, the answer is some version of, yeah, but they got lucky, yeah, but they're not that good, yeah, but it doesn't count. You know, they find some way to justify to themselves that what they've seen isn't real as such, that there's some hidden side that invalidates it. And to be fair, in modern times, quite a lot of what you see online does fall into this category, right? For sure. But a lot of the time, people just don't want to admit that they might be doing something completely wrong. You know, it's the crab in a bucket that sees another crab escape and spends all of its energy convincing himself that it hasn't actually escaped. You know, it doesn't actually count, instead of figuring out how they did it. Because if it does count, then they have to ask themselves why they haven't done that themselves, and admit that there's probably a very simple reason behind it. And that is incredibly uncomfortable to do, right? So it would have been so easy for Zoro to do this, to look at Mihawk and say it's unfair. You know, the gap is too large, there's no point, to turn his back on what happened and retreat into the comfort of, I'll just work harder, to convince himself that he'll show him one day if he just grinds and hustles enough, right? But he doesn't step back. He faces the man who destroyed him with just a bread knife and keeps his eyes wide open. He accepts the reality in front of him without flinching from it. And this is something Mihawk has immense respect for, that he recognizes as an incredibly rare strength, one that could lead Zoro all the way to challenging him properly one day. But what does Zoro do after the most humiliating defeat of his life? He trains harder. Right, of course he does, because that seems perfectly reasonable, doesn't it? That's what anyone would do after that kind of frustration. That's what I would have done, right? For hundreds of chapters, he trains like an absolute madman. You know, he pushes beyond every limit. But there is something in this world that he has no access to, no knowledge of. Not because he lacks the talent, not because he hasn't earned it, but because nobody taught him, and he never asked. Haki, the manifestation of willpower, and it's effectively a prerequisite to making it far in the world of One Piece. There are people out there with exactly what you want. Most of them are not more talented than you, and a lot of them, honestly, work less hard than you. You can probably name quite a lot of them, and if you're anything like me, it really pisses you off, right? But what I started to realize as I got older is that they've just learned from people you're not willing to learn from. They have knowledge that is completely accessible to you if you can bring yourself to ask for it. They were completely willing to look at what works and realize the very simple truth that neither hard work or talent guarantees anything. And that's why I always love this archetype of the big fish leaving its small pond, immediately hitting a wall upon doing so and having to come to terms with it. Seeing how they respond to the reality that they're not the only gifted person in the world, that all the work they've put in doesn't guarantee victory, and slowly or suddenly acknowledge that they're not doing everything right, that simply working harder isn't the answer to their problems. You know, Barra from Blue Lock, going from being able to win every single match without needing or even wanting to pass, to suffering his first defeat to someone he thought nothing of. Or Bakugo from MHA. No one would have even dared to challenge him before he came to UA High. Suddenly, he actually loses a training exercise to someone who should be infinitely weaker than him. He looks at some of the other students and thinks to himself, I can't beat them. it's the first time in their lives that they've had to wrestle with those kind of thoughts. And they could bury that frustration beneath working harder. They could fight that despair with more grit and resolve. But what eventually gets both of them to the next level is the same thing. They stop being too proud to think that they know everything, that they're doing everything right. They learn from the people around them. Bakugo realizes that there's likely things that he's not even aware of that he needs to do. So he asks Endeavor to teach him what he's missing. He even asks Deku about his thought process. Bakugo tries to understand how Isagi sees the pitch. They look at someone they used to dismiss and ask, what are you doing that I'm not? And so, 546 chapters after Mihawk destroyed him with a bread knife, Zoro stands on an island surrounded by giant weapon-wielding baboons. He defeats them all, and at this point he could leave, right? There's nothing holding him on this island anymore. Instead, he walks to the man who gave him the worst defeat of his life, who humiliated him. The man he has devoted his entire existence to surpassing, but he doesn't charge him for a rematch to finally prove him wrong. Instead, he gets on his knees, forehead to the ground, a dogiza, the most extreme, most humiliating form of request in Japanese culture, reserved for moments of absolute desperation or absolute sincerity. And so, Mihawk assumes it's desperation, right? That Zoro is stuck and can't escape, because there's no way anyone would do this otherwise after everything that's happened, right? Especially not someone so driven by pride and honor that refused to even turn his back when being cut. It's repulsive to Mihawk at first because he figures this is Zoro's last resort to get out alive, but it's not. There's nothing making Zoro do this. He's choosing this. I've seen some people talk about the scene as Zoro sacrificing his dream for Luffy, right? Mihawk even says that you must have found a cause greater than your own ambition. And don't get me wrong, I do think that Zoro likely does place Luffy's dream above his own because he believes he owes his life to him, right? And also, of course, for someone who lives and breathes Bushido and carries himself with such honor and pride, it must have been incredibly difficult for Zoro to swallow all of that and do this. And when people call this Zoro sacrificing his dream for Luffy, I completely disagree. That is not what he's doing. This is Zoro finally, after 500 chapters of spinning his wheels, doing the single most important thing for his dream he has ever done. Because the bottleneck was clearly not effort, right? It was never talent or discipline. It was pride. The refusal to look at someone who had what he wanted and say, teach me, instead of I'll beat you. He could have spent the rest of his life training to get stronger, get faster, get more disciplined, and he likely never would have become the world's greatest swordsman. And whilst they no doubt will be forced to face off one day, right? Mihawk was not Zoro's enemy at this stage. A rival, perhaps, right? But not an enemy. And so it only has to be a rivalry of hatred if Zoro makes it one. And I really doubt you're in the same situation he is, where you and whoever it is you're looking at are going to have to cross swords one day. So there's no reason you can't put all that resentment and pride aside too. You don't have to walk around with all this negativity and wishing you had what other people did. You can just see what they're doing and start doing the same. And I found that, for me at least, if I'm really honest with myself, the reason why I had that kind of reaction I did to other people's success is because I didn't think it was possible for me to get the same. So my brain would automatically come up with something to kind of make myself feel less awful about it, right? Which is a side note. People do this a lot with just anime and manga in general whenever someone says that they don't like their, favorite series. You know how there's always a bunch of comments saying, oh, you just didn't understand, just as an X fan, etc. It's a similar thing, right? They see something and they instinctively have to justify it in their heads, even though it's probably complete nonsense. But going back to the original point, when I make these videos, I tend to base them off my younger self's mistakes, right? And one, I've had plenty of phases when I was younger where I just thought, oh, well, I'm working harder than, so I... And one, I've had plenty of phases when I was younger where I thought, oh, well, I'm working harder than them, so I deserve more, right? Not understanding that, one, that's just, not how it works at all. And really, I was just using it as a cover because I didn't want to admit that I didn't know what I was doing, right? As just a way to patch over those feelings of inadequacy. And two, I think a lot of the resentment and frustration I had when seeing other people's success came down to the fact that I didn't think it was possible for me. It seemed so out of reach, so far away that I just had to come up with something to make myself feel better. But I promise, it's not nearly as out of reach as it seems. I promise that if you want to, you can learn how to do whatever you want these days. And you can start to go from, working super hard, being really frustrated that you're not seeing any kind of results, to actually starting to get pretty excited when you see what other people are doing, because you know that you'll be there too one day. Again, as mentioned earlier, there's plenty of people BSing online. And so that's why I want to say one last thing about Zoro, because I honestly think it's super, super important, especially these days. And that's that for all his desperation to obtain that title, it was his childhood dream, it's basically what he's dedicated his entire life for. He still sees the world outside of that goal. And I'm not just talking about, Thriller Bark, right, where he volunteered his own life to save his captains, but consistently throughout the story from his very first introduction, he has never let his ambition blind him to doing the right thing. In his very first scene, once Luffy steps past his menacing aura, Zoro puts it all on hold for a month to be captured and starved, obviously unable to train, purely to help out a girl that had nothing to do with him. He eats the rice balls she made for him, even if they were trampled into the mud, so she wouldn't feel bad. She wasn't even around to know he'd done that, but he just had such strong principles. Even when there's no reward for it, no spectators to congratulate or admire him, Roronoa Zoro always made sure to be a good man, a great one even. It's clear that his run-in with Mihawk really changed him, it hardened him, and later down the line when the crew has its first major fallout and Usopp leaves, Luffy was willing to welcome him back with open arms. But not Zoro. Zoro demanded that Usopp apologize for, knowing that with what he'd seen of Mihawk, of the wider world, the crew couldn't just play at being pirates anymore. They had to follow a higher standard, act like adults, or that cruel world would eat them alive. But despite that, despite what he'd seen and what it had done to him, that part of him that would eat a clump of rice covered in mud as to not upset a girl he has nothing to do with, never left him. Even if it was inconvenient or go in the way of training towards his goal, he'd never sacrificed that side of him. He'd sacrifice his pride, his ego, even his life if needs be, but never his code.
何もなかった。